Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third session of CME Palooza Fall. Let me bring up our slides here. There we go. Putting the Improvement and Quality Improvement session is sponsored by Academic CME, Antidote Education Company, and Vindico CME. Our moderator today will be Dean Beals, President and CEO of DKB Med. But before I turn things over to Dean, of course, the recognition of all of our sponsors. Our gold sponsors, Daiichi Sankyo, Med Learning Group, and PER. Our silver sponsors, ACHL, Academic CME, Antidote Education Company, Catamount Medical Education, and DKB Med. Hippocrates, Helio CME, Medscape Education, Integrity CE, and Platform Q Health Education, Prova Education, Red Med Ed, and Vindico Medical Education. Bronze sponsors, Answers in CME, AxDev, Bonum Continuing Education, Creative Educational Concepts, CMEology, Excalibur Medical Education, Global Education Group, Infograph Ed, MedIQ, last slide, PACE, Paradigm Medical Communications, Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, PriMed, PVI, RMEI, Medical Education, Right Medicine. And lastly, a big thank you to Talem Health, who sponsored our CME Palooza Spectacular Challenge last week. If you didn't get a chance to participate, you were missing out. So big thank you to them as well. 3 different ways that you can ask questions at CME Palooza. You can use the CME Outfitters text line to send in a question, 267-666-0CME. You can tweet your questions using the CME Palooza hashtag. And you can also use the YouTube chat function. If you click on the watch on YouTube in the lower left corner, you'll go to watch this on YouTube, and you can use the chat there. I'll be monitoring all of the different ways. We will be using Poll Everywhere, and big thank you to Broadcast Beat Studios for supporting that. If you haven't already, go ahead and download the Poll Everywhere app and use CME Palooza 005, or you can just simply type in the pollev.com/CMEPalooza 005 URL in your web browser. And last thing from me, any opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or a position of their employer, its parent company, or affiliates. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Dean. Take it away.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate it. I've got some wonderful panelists who I'll introduce in just a moment, or let them introduce themselves in just a moment. So today's talk is really about putting the improvement in quality improvement. And we have been doing quality improvement, as you know, for quite a number of years. All of us in this community. It used to be called PICME. We still do a little bit of that. Now, of course, quality improvement. But we're going to get into that in just a second. But first, if I could have the next slide, let me let our presenters introduce themselves. Again, I'm Dean Beals. I'm the president and CEO of DKB Med. And now I'll turn it over to, we'll start with Michael. Michael?
Hey everybody, Mike Riley. I run the MedEd team at Regeneron in beautiful Sleepy Hollow, New York, and I am now clean shaven and being blinded by the sun.
Thank you, Mike. Myra?
Hi everyone, I'm Myra Cervantes at Gilead Sciences, and I manage global MedEd for liver disease and COVID-19.
Great. And Andrea?
All right. I'm Andrea Harshman. I'm the director of the Office of Professional Education at National Jewish Health in Denver. We're an academic medical center.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you, everyone should be looking forward to a great presentation from them. I don't know about me, but we've got some great co-presenters. So next slide, please. Actually, the next slide is going to be our survey. So we're going to have 2 references to survey says, and here is the first one. So if you could tell us, are you a supporter, a medical education company, or other? And we'll give you a second to respond to that. All right. The supporters are obviously faster because that came in at 100% right away. So good for you. But now I'm afraid you're declining in the ranks. Let's see where we end up here. All right, kind of looks like we're settling out, Derek. Is this a pretty good barometer, you think? Great.
Yep.
So we have about 10%, 9% supporters, about 30% MEX, and 61% others. I'd be curious as to who the others are. feel free at some point to put in the chat who you are. I'd be curious. Oh, mechs are making a little bit of a comeback. All right, moving on to the next question. So have you ever created or supported, if you're a supporter, a QI program? So again, have you ever created or supported a QI program? Wow, it's going back and forth. So far, it looks like most of you have. We'll give it a little while for things to settle down here. 60% looks like they have, and somewhere around 30-40%. I think we're in pretty good range. So it sounds like the majority, but certainly not a vast majority, the majority of you have. All right, great. Next question, please. What were the reasons that you created or supported a QI program, right? Did you see a need, or did you just simply want higher level outcomes because someone in your organization was perhaps asking for that? Or you wanted to do a smaller program in a healthcare system. So you just had the desire to do something in a healthcare system that was perhaps not as big as a program might be to multiple learners in multiple healthcare systems. So looks like higher level outcome. Well, oops, saw a need. So let's let this settle down. But it looks like those are the two that seem to be winning. So saw a need for this and wanted higher level outcomes. Okay, terrific. Next slide, please, or next question, please. So have you ever used data from an EMR? And by EMR, we mean Epic, Cerno, any of the electronic medical or data records programs. Have you ever used data from those programs to assess the success of a QI CME program? So ever use data from those? So that means you would have to get them from whoever that system belonged to if you don't work in that setting, and use that data to analyze. So it looks like about a little more than half of you have, and about half of you have not. So interesting. All right, next question. Now this is going to be an interesting one. I'm curious. Have you ever used claims data? So this is third-party claims data that typically looks at things like prescriptions to analyze the success of a CME or QI program. So again, how many of you have used claims data? Because one of the things we're going to be talking about a little bit later is whether or not your particular practice setting allows for you to use claims data. So it looks like about a third of you or thereabouts have, and the full 63% do not. Okay, great. Next question, please. This is for supporters only, so only if you're a supporter would you answer. Does your organization permit you to support programs using data from electronic medical records? Again, the Epics of the world, or the Cernos of the world. Does your organization, your pharmaceutical company presumably, permit you to support programs using data from EMRs? So looking like about 3/4 of you do. I'll give it a moment to settle down, but it looks like the vast majority of you do. That's great. Okay. Oh, 80%. That's terrific. All right. So now we're going to go to the flip side of that, which is claims data. So if you were to reach out to IQVIA or any of the other companies that might provide you with claims data, and again, this is for supporters only, does your organization permit you to support programs that use claims data? So interesting. Derek, do you have any idea how many people have responded to this? Can you see that?
I do not.
You don't. Okay, I'm curious.
Let's say hundreds.
Hundreds of people. I got to tell you, I don't know about my fellow panelists, but I am a little surprised at that. I didn't think, just talking with different organizations, and maybe they're not represented here, that 100% would allow for the use of claims data. That's great. Okay. And I think that maybe, is there one more question?
One more.
Maybe one more. So have you had a positive experience? So if you've done a program using data from both the electronic medical record and or claims data, have you had a positive experience? Has this been good? Yeah, we were so close. 100% positive, which truly shocked me. But okay. So about, yes is really, wow. Okay, interesting. Interesting. So looks like about half and half, and yeah, whatever. We'll settle somewhere in between here. But clearly, some of you have it, and some of you haven't. Hopefully, in the Q&A section at the end of this, we can get a little bit of your thoughts and insight. All righty. So we're going to move on to the next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Andrea. So, Andrea.
Thanks, Dean. Really, we're just starting off with some background, basic background about quality improvement, and we use Moore's levels pyramid to highlight, most of us are very experienced with traditional CME, which is on the lower part of the pyramid, and we're really here to talk about higher level outcomes, but higher impact improvement with performance, measuring patient health, and community health. And as I think we could see just even from the survey, I thought the last one was fascinating, that half of the group said they didn't have a positive experience and half said they did, looking at data. And that's really what we're doing at these higher levels. It's a different type of data. So I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide with kind of just a definition of quality improvement that I think we as a group thought was helpful. But it's the combined and unceasing efforts of everyone: healthcare professionals, patients, their families, researchers, payers, planners, and educators, to make the changes that will lead to better patient outcomes, better system performance, and better professional development. I mean, I think what's important about this is it takes a lot of people to kind of move the needle at these higher levels. And really, I think engagement, empowerment of the team who is delivering care and providing, I think, structure, tools and skills that they need to improve care is really a big, important part of what we're trying to do with quality improvement type activities. So with that, I'm gonna hand it back over to Dean.
Great, thanks, Andrea. So next slide, please. All right, so this really comes down to when we should or shouldn't do quality improvement. So here's the sort of group's view on this, and I don't know if you out there agree or disagree, but really we feel it's when you can identify something that is not working and where QI could help. So what kinds of situations are those? Perhaps there's a process that is not working. Perhaps not enough patients are being screened for something. Perhaps there's a lot of medication errors in a particular area. So when there's something that's not working optimally and where a QI initiative could help. Also, clearly, when patients' care can be improved. We do a lot of QI programs, and we'll talk about those in diabetic eye, in HIV, where patients are not being screened for those particular conditions. So clearly, there's an opportunity here to improve patient care using a quality improvement program. When an education and systems-based approach can make a difference. So when we do QI, and it doesn't often always have to be the case, but when we do, and I think most of the people in the CME enterprise do CME, it really combines education and systems changes, right? You can certainly do QI by just doing the systems change, but we don't feel that's as effective as coupling that with education so that people really understand why you're doing what you're doing, right? Why are you changing this system in a particular way? So we think that that's important, and I'm sure my panelists will agree. And then this one is super important. You've got to have committed and willing partners who may want to be committed by the end of the process, depending on how it goes, but committed and willing partners. And that means all the way up and down the line. So if you are partnering with a health system, every single level of that health system needs to be committed to this particular project. Medical education, clearly the medical education company and any partners with those companies needs to believe in this and needs to make sure that they are willing to do what needs to be done. These are not easy things to do. They require a heavy lift, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The community. So if there is a community out there of learners, a community within the organization, all of those folks need to be part of this. And then, of course, supporters in industry. And while we certainly do have firewalls that are put in place by the ACCME, this does require some conversation, appropriate conversation, but conversation and support with supporters. I think if you don't bring supporters along and help them understand what the expectations are and what the limits and value of doing this is, it's hard to do an effective QI program. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who'll talk a little bit more about the value from his perspective. So Mike.
Thanks, Dean. So when we look at, next slide, Derek. Thanks. When we look at the value of QI, right? First of all, QI, we hear you don't really use QI at this organization. We're really calling it RWE, real world evidence, when we do these types of things, because we're trying to impact patient health, which is the most important component of these types of programs, actually everything that we do. And so changing the way that HCPs behave to ultimately improve patient outcomes is exactly what we're trying to do. And so that's the main driving force of these types of things. The other part that's a side benefit that we find very, very valuable at Regeneron is to really prove the value of medical education with real data. Right. And that kind of flows into the difference between changing someone and measuring someone's knowledge, like a level 3 type of program, to actually, I guess the best way to say it is, I don't care what you know, I care what you do. And can we show that? Can we measure that? Can we prove that? And that makes these programs that are extremely difficult to enact, makes them worth it in the end, by all means. And we'll show you some of that data in a few minutes. Go ahead, next slide. Dean?
Actually,
thanks,
this one
Mike.
is Mara. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. So from a supporter perspective, what are we really looking for when considering these QI initiatives? And some of this, reiterates a lot of what Mike spoke to. So when we're looking at a health system, we really want to work with the health system that's also willing to work with us and requires, as we know, as Dean also mentioned, that requires a lot of time and commitment to implement a QI program. So with that being said, it also requires some flexibility from both sides. And then the faculty, of course, we trust our providers to select the appropriate faculty for that specific program. And then when we get into the learning platform, we think about, will it really work for QI? Will it actually, again, move the needle on practice change, not just on knowledge? So at Gilead, that's also a big focus for us when looking at these programs. And then in terms of technology, so EMR is an example, that is one change, that is one method of technology that will effectively create change. But other examples we look at are point of care tools and applications, really tools that are fit for purpose. And then when we look at, programs specific that are focused on patient learners, we want to make sure that we consider tools that those patients can actually access. And so if you think of us as your stakeholder, in quality improvement, or think of us that way, not just, seeing again an increase in knowledge, but really we're invested in seeing that practice change. And then when we look at developing the plan, the first and crucial step is, to really align on our purpose and goals of the program, which also feeds into building the appropriate timeline and the budget. And then again, with being flexible, understanding that the original program design, it might not go according to plan, and that we're being able to adapt to that. And then in terms of outcomes measurements, as Andrea spoke to, we are looking for higher level outcomes. But one thing to also consider, if it's an appropriate program where we can implement possibly interim reporting. So could it help us identify any barriers early into the program that may allow us to pivot a little bit quicker? And then also during the development stage, it's important to consider a program that's both sustainable and scalable. That's something that we really look for as well when reviewing these programs. And then in terms of enacting the plan, can the planning process, can it begin as early as possible? Again, we understand that it takes a lot of parties, and it might take a lot of time to implement something, but can we spend more time on implementation? So for example, in cases where, we're collecting data from the health system, can that be can that timeline be reduced at all? And then in terms of having a backup plan, we just want to make sure that um, we keep the overall vision in mind. We work when it comes to getting back on track. If it's a line, we can do a change of scope, so that's not too big of a deal. We can work on that. But in terms of delays, when it comes to communication, we know it might be a hard conversation to have with your supporters, but the sooner you could do that with us, the better. And then we have that, we're able to work with any hiccups and move forward from there.
Thanks, Mara.
And
Mara, let me ask you a question here, and Mike as well. So the backup plan. I'm sure every single QI program that you've supported has gone 100% well from beginning to end. So you've never had to have these conversations. But what do you encourage partners, medical education providers to do in terms of talking to you about this program when things might go awry? And how often do you recommend just regular check-ins? Is that something that you're both comfortable with?
Mike?
yeah, I think it's important to, in the beginning, kind of establish the cadence that you want to, meet with your educational partner. But sometimes in these cases, over communication, might be a good thing. And that way you can kind of address the issue, any foresight of any hiccups quicker.
Yeah, these are not inexpensive programs, and they are extremely complex. Not only in what we'll call the regular logistics of a program and the instructional design of these programs, because we're trying to change a clinician's behavior. That is really complex and really hard to do. But because they're inexpensive, because they're expensive, we'll call it expensive because everything in CME is expensive. They're also very high visibility. So potentially very high visibility, because these are rarely done events. These are really demonstration projects. And I mean, we want to make huge hay with the wins that we anticipate happening. So there's a lot riding on these. So what that means is we should be communicating a lot, right? And keep the supporters apprised of what's going on, where the wheels fell off, what may or may not be happening, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that we're not caught by surprise. And so I would really, Dean, I don't know if I would say we should talk daily, right, or weekly, but I would assume at least monthly, if not more. And it's not like we block phone calls, right? So we'll talk a lot. So.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Mike. I think also I find that with these kinds of programs, the supporters that tend to support them do want more sort of engagement and interaction than with a standard, quote unquote, program. Andrea, what about you from your perspective? Do you find talking particularly within your organization with the other partners that you have to work with is important, and how often do you do that?
So most of the funded quality improvement projects we have done, there wasn't another MEC involved. So we may operate different than other hospital health systems. We're fairly small and specialized, but absolutely you have to talk. I think if something if a QI project went as it was planned 100%, like something maybe didn't work there. I almost don't know how it could go exactly to plan. So, which I don't think is a bad thing. We've had programs where the lead, PI is what we called it. I mean, left a month in, right? And I would say that's not a unique situation. It's not that it happens all the time. So you just need to communicate. And we really had to work on, can we complete it as we planned? And really communicating with the funder, we may need a little more time. So as Myra was saying, I think as long as you communicate internally with your folks, but externally with the funder, it really does work well as long as you just keep everybody in the loop and I think be transparent in what you're doing and how it's going. Because they really want to support you. To Mike's point, this is high visibility, and our whole goal, everybody, is to improve physician behavior, to improve patient outcomes. So I don't know if that answered your question, Dean. But
No, absolutely, it did. And actually, if we go to the next slide, it's where we pick up. So what are some of the challenges? So tell us, Andrea, on the QI projects that you've worked on, what have been some of the challenges that you faced, and how have you dealt with them?
The example of the PI leaving the organization, and we were very worried that would, kind of crash the program. We had another fantastic physician step in, and it actually ended up winning an award. So again, things can look bad and actually turn out well. Lots of other things, just communication within the organization. One of the challenges with QI projects is it does take time to plan because you have to have conversations at high levels. The head of medicine has to be on board, the head of biostatistics. I mean, there's just so many departments within an organization, right? The IT folks need to be on board. You need different things than than they provide in their normal operations. Staffing, we talked about that. Buy-in. So buy-in has to be at the beginning, and then you need that champion to keep it going, because sometimes people get tired when there's a longer initiative. So I think having it structured with funding and a grant helps keep everybody accountable and moving forward. That kind of speaks to the inertia. We didn't talk a lot about this, but the IRB is important, at least if you're working within an institution and you want to do some publishing. So most of the time, QI projects should be considered exempt, but you want them looked at so you can publish about them. So I don't know how much you want to go into that, but that's definitely something you need to think about, even if you're an outside mech. Do they have their own IRB where you are? How are you going to handle that piece of it? Changing priorities is, sorry, go ahead. Were you saying something, Dee? Oh, sorry. Let's see, changing priorities. That definitely comes up. Again, I think it's just keeping, it's communication. Internally, when you're running the project, you have to keep reiterating the importance of this and the commitment that has been made. And I found most people get that, even, the pandemic was a different thing. So obviously those priorities trump lots of other ones, but in general, keeping focused on that is good. I don't know unless there's specific questions or more directed that I can answer, but those are kind of overarching kind of issues.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrea. I'll talk briefly about other partners. I think capacity and staffing is continuing to be a big issue. Within healthcare systems, I don't have to tell anybody on this call, we all know that the healthcare system has been challenged lately in terms of staffing. So you really do need to find a healthcare system that is committed to doing this and that has the capacity and the staff to do it. I think that's an important part. Clear roles, making sure that everybody knows what their roles are and that no one's stepping on each other's feet. I think that's certainly important. And then flexibility. As we said, things will go wrong. So you need to be able to pivot. You need to be able to find another cheerleader, you need to be able to find another PI, you need to be able to even pivot potentially between parts of a healthcare system if need be. So all that's important. And let me turn to Mike and Myra just to talk about the challenges from a supporter's perspective. So Myra, you want to start? Or?
Sure. So in terms of looking at like timing or timeline, since I feel like we're supporting these programs because they are complicated problems which require complicated solutions. So of course, again, that's going to require a lot of time. But when we're trying to show the value of a program, it is hard to do within, a program that might span 2 years. So kind of to be able to get the metrics for a program that's that endures a long time. And then in terms of legal, our legal team does allow, EMR claims data, but sometimes it depends on who you're working with. It could be interpreted, as return on investment. So just trying to navigate that can be a challenge. And then again, with the communication, just making sure that there's full transparency across the board and that we're notified of any changes or any challenges, the sooner the better.
Great. Mike?
I agree. I think legal is by far the most complex part of these things because, it's a minefield and depends on what you are measuring. You can't improve if you don't measure. And it depends on what it is that you're going to measure. If you're measuring impact on treatment, for instance, which is, one of the ways that we do it, you can't measure script changes on a specific product, right? That's a big no-no. And so legal looks for that. We can look at classes, drug class, but we can't, or therapy type, but we can't do a specific drug. And we've had projects that come in that look at that and they are immediately shot down because they mention the product, right? So legal crawls all over these things. So that's a hurdle. So.
Great, thanks. We have one question come in, but I think we'll save it until we get to the Q&A. But I think it's a great question about EMR and claims data. So next slide, please. So Mike, you bring up a really good point. How do you measure this? Well, there are lots of ways to measure the success of these programs. Clearly, educational measurement, right? Moore's level 5 and 6. But EMR data, it needs to be de-identified. What data are you going to look at and how often? And that's one thing that we think is critical. You really need to limit the amount of data that you're collecting or analyzing. Don't try to have tons and tons of endpoints that you're looking at because it will just not paint a very clear picture. But look at things that you really want to change. And again, go back to the beginning and say, what is it that we're looking to do here? And what measurements will make that happen? And then you also need to take a look at how often. Mike and Myra both said, you're not going to want to wait 2 years, right, before we have some readout on this. We're going to want to know sooner. How many people were screened? How many people changed their behavior about X, Y, or Z? So there needs to be some readouts in between. And then claims data, as Mike alluded to a moment ago. De-identified for sure. Can we do it by class? Most places will say yes, but some won't. So the question was, and maybe we can address this here, can anyone expand on the reasoning behind why you would not be allowed to use EMR or claims data? I personally have had several supporters say to me, and that's why I was a little surprised, and maybe it's a biased sample by our survey, that they cannot use claims data. Their organization will absolutely not support a grant, Mike, one, that has claims data in it. So I think that does vary from organization to organization. And it sounds like, obviously the reason that Mike and Myra are on the phone today, or on this webcast today, is because their organizations will allow things like that and will allow this. So anyone else have any thoughts about why an organization may or may not allow EMR or claims data?
Well, compliance, right? I mean, compliance is a huge issue, and the safest answer for a compliance question is no. Right? Compliance is built to avoid risk for an organization, and if you don't take any risks, there's no risk. So.
Yeah, back in the day when there used to be newspapers, what people would say is, I don't want this on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or whatever publication. And I think that's the reason that some people would not want to do this, because particularly when it comes to claims, it gets too close to that edge that some organizations have real trouble with. So you just have to be careful, and you have to understand your supporting group. I don't think any CME provider would have an issue with using either of those, but I do think I know some supporters do.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Dean, when you bring up that Wall Street Journal quote, because I've been hearing that for 20 plus years now. And my response was always been, I hope that it goes on the cover of the Wall Street Journal because what we did is so good, right? What we funded changed behavior. That's fantastic. It should be, there. And as long as it is blessed by legal and blessed by compliance and is good education that has changed, a patient outcome for the better, yeah, I want it reported on the New York Times front page.
Right.
And I think
Excellent.
too,
Go
it
ahead.
could be dependent. I mean, I can't speak for other companies, but for example, if there's multiple players in this space, versus just having only one drug in the market, they're going to be, of course, way more resistant to approve a program that offers claims data.
Absolutely. Yep. Okay. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do now, I want to spend like about, maybe 10, 15 minutes on this if we can, just being sensitive to time. So we have a little time at the end for Q&A, to talk about some sample outcomes from some programs that we've all been involved with, just to give you an idea. So next slide, please. Oh, I guess Mike, you're first. I guess it got out of order, but go ahead. No problem. Start up. Go for it.
Fair enough. All right. So this is a really interesting program that we funded through our oncology franchise. And it was to measure improvements in care in skin cancer, specifically cutaneous squamous cell and basal cell. And so the reason I put this slide in is because I want everybody to see the amount of parameters that go into designing these studies early on. Now, this is done by IQVIA, and IQVIA is typically a company that provides data to the commercial side of the organization. So this is one of the things that we've learned doing these is we have to translate IQVIA's commercial language to our medical affairs language because they often don't work. And so this is often a pitfall of these programs because IQVIA is used to talking to the commercial side of the business and measuring the impact on specific drugs. We can't do that. So, I kind of call your attention to the market definition of this program. There's 8 or 9 or 10 different drugs within the treatment paradigm for cutaneous, squamous, and basal cell. This program measured all of them. So let's go to the next slide in the interest of time. Okay, so these are real outcomes. It was a large program, generated 7,000 learners. You can see on the right there the types of learners. We had dermatologists, derm surgeons, oncologists, and oncology surgeons that went in to see the content. And so we had 7,000 learners and then a like number of non-learners as our control group, right? The exact same type of clinician. Next slide, please. That's a lot of learners, by the way. So here's kind of where it starts to get really sexy. And when we look at the improvement between learners and non-learners, 431 new skin cancer treatments in the learner group over the non-learner group. So that's really interesting. What really is intriguing to me is if you look in the lower right corner, right? Oncologists increased by 17% and derm surgeons increased by 41%. What I find really intriguing about that is a 41% increase in surgeons who like to cut. And so now they're moving from surgery to pharmaceutical therapy, one of those 8 or 9 products that we had mentioned earlier. I find that really intriguing. Okay, next slide, please. Right. So here's the view from Saturn. And so 431 new skin cancer treatments. Don't even worry about the refill ratio. That's some weirdness that IQVIA does. What I'm really intrigued by is the initial treatment. And along the bottom there, you can see that along the clinical learning continuum, we've moved from beyond awareness, beyond agreement, and into adoption. And what we're showing is that physicians have moved away from what they do every day and into some new territory for them, right? These were measured in deciles 0 through 3, which are the lower level treating types of physicians. And that's where you expect to see change. You're not going to see change in a decile 6 or 7 physician because they're already doing so much anyway. So we've moved the needle in these types of docs. Next, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Mike.
Yep.
Terrific. So I actually want to come back to something, but we'll wait to the Q&A. You can go advance to the next slide. That's fine. Thank you. So this is a program called Saving Sight that we were involved in, and thanks to Mike for his support for this particular program. And we've done this multiple times. But basically, as you know, patients with type 2 diabetes are sadly routinely not screened for diabetic eye. You know, guidelines say every 1 to 2 years, depending on the guideline, and they're simply not. Why? Because they're not going to eye care professionals to get screened for all the reasons that people don't go see people they're supposed to see, right? But the problem is long-term elevated glucose levels can lead to both diabetic retinopathy and diabetic edema. So the thought is, what if we bring the screening to the patient? What if we actually screen within the primary care practice using either a traditional or even more exciting, a camera equipped with artificial intelligence? And then refer those patients who need to be referred onto the ophthalmologist. And not for nothing, but ophthalmologists are overwhelmed with patients. You try to get an appointment with an ophthalmologist, you could wait 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, depending on where you live, and that is valuable time. So if we can take that screening away from them and put it in the hands of primary care and only refer those patients who actually need to see them, then we've done a tremendous service. Next slide, please. I'm going to take you through this very quickly, but basically what we did in Lancaster, Pennsylvania at a group called Lancaster General Health, which consisted of 34 primary care practices, is we instituted annual screening at the primary care level. Through an EMR reminder, it was actually an order set, and we can talk about the value of pop-ups versus order sets at some point. Retinal cameras that were installed in the practice, people that were actually screened at that practice setting. We, of course, did education around all of this to highlight the importance of regular screening so that everyone involved in the screening process could do it. Screening is actually quite simple. It's even simpler. This was not, but now we're doing these programs with AI cameras, and it's even simpler. With the other cameras, you have the burden of sending it off to a retina specialist. With the AI cameras, you actually know right away whether or not that patient has diabetic retinopathy or diabetic macular edema. And then within the practice, a referral coordinator who, as soon as that diagnosis comes to pass, makes sure that that patient gets referred. Sometimes it's within the healthcare system if there's an ophthalmologist, and sometimes it's outside, depending. So we found vision abnormalities in almost 60% of patients. So either diabetic eye or glaucoma or other kinds of retina diseases, we found in 60% of patients. If you look over on the right, you can see we increased screening by 33% from the pre-period to the post-period. And of those people that were screened, 42%, 355 had diabetic retinopathy, and another 145 had another abnormality. So if you look and you do the math here, we save potentially vision in a whole lot of people in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We also took a look at claims data, and we saw that there were increases across the board for earlier treatment, as well as per provider increases in treatment, as well as increases for the top 5 retina specialists in the region. In Lancaster, they're not embedded in the healthcare system, they're in the community. So we took a look at those community retina specialists and saw among the top 5 a 460% increase in referral to those retina specialists. So clearly the screening was happening in the primary care practice, but then it was having an impact on the back end when people could actually get care of a retina specialist. So I'm not going to say anything more about this because I want to get on to have Andrea and Myra talk about their initiative. So next slide, please.
All right. So I'm going to talk about a project that appears to be much smaller in scale than Dean and Mike's examples, but I think the impact is still important. And so we did a project where we worked with 3 community clinics outside of our institution, federally qualified health centers, with the goal to identify rheumatoid arthritis patients early and get appropriate treatment. And so in doing that, we really had to look at our process at how we receive referrals for rheumatoid arthritis or suspected rheumatoid arthritis. So we use traditional CME for some of that to educate our partners about what they need to be looking for, that sort of thing. And then we worked on process improvements in our own institution. As an example, we never kind of prioritized people who just got referred into our rheumatology department. So as Dean was speaking to, specialists sometimes take a lot of time to get into. So how do we do something for a disease that the sooner they get some treatment can actually affect the course disease activity? So we looked at all of our referrals that come into National Jewish Health, how many came in thinking it was early RA versus how many actually then had a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis. And in that process, I think the big number here is we reduced time to seeing a specialist from on average 103 days, reduced that by 76 to 27 days. So we were getting people in within a month. And you can also look at 100% of those patients within 3 months were on the appropriate treatment. And most of those, the 51%, were on their first visit. And so 65 may seem like a small number, but those are individual people and their lives were affected by getting early treatment and getting in to a rheumatologist sooner than the 103 days that was our standard before. So, and we also, we reached out to our providers and was this sustainable? And so this project was probably 4 or 5 years ago. We still have a rheumatology specific referral line. We have basically these set aside appointments that if somebody needs to come in emergently and get in sooner, we have those appointments set aside for those. So there's a lot of things from this that still are happening, but we thought this was great impact. A smaller project, but really affected our community in the Denver area. So, and I did want to acknowledge that Pfizer did support this particular project. I think there's one more slide about it. It's just, I think the next slide, yeah. So again, I talked about this and I know we're running short on time, so I won't belabor it, but it's just, this is to give you an example of the kind of data that we're pulling. We did look at, did they get prescribed their medication? To Mike's point, it was based on the class, not specific drugs. And so, looking at EMR data, it does give you, real world evidence, to Mike's point, of what you're actually doing with your project. So next slide.
Great, thank you. So Myra?
Thanks, Dean. So this program I want to highlight is a program we co-supported with AbbVie, and it was a program developed by Integritas. We co-supported it for about 6 years now, but it's still ongoing. But the data being reflected here is from spans from 2017 to 2020. So kind of along the same lines as Andrea's program, it was built on a smaller scale, but it does continue to have a very large impact. And the goal of this program is to get people who inject drugs diagnosed and linked to care. And it was designed to provide parallel tracks of education. So one for the addiction service providers and one for the HCV treaters. And the intent was to promote screening, patient education, and linkage to care. And then on the HCV treater side, for community treaters to improve rates of treating people who inject drugs for currently active HCV treaters. And it also provided the foundational education for new treaters. And then in looking at the bar graphs for addiction service providers, we can see that the follow-up data does show that intent does translate to practice change here. And a lot of that we can attribute to the close working nature of everyone in the program. So with the community-based faculty, they were able to really make meaningful connections and work through different types of practical issues and offer real support while establishing the linkage and referral relationships. And then looking at the HCV treaters on follow-up, again, we see a high percentage of learners actually implementing their practice changes. And next slide, please. So lastly, I won't go over all of this qualitative data, but mainly just to show, again, that showing changes that were implemented by both the addiction service providers and the treaters. And it shows that the systematic change really required a whole team effort. And it was also not just systematic change, but education being provided as well. So it had a positive impact on patient care and outcomes, as well as increased treatment and increased implementation of harm reduction education. And I'll pass it over to you, Dean.
Great. Thank you so much, Mara. So I'm going to put up the next slide, please, which is just sort of the takeaways. And at the same time, in the interest of time, maybe start going through some questions here because there are a few. So I will ask you, Andrea, and I can comment as well, and then Mike and Mara. How often had you have to fall back on your QI backup plan? What would you say?
Well, what I would say is, I don't know that you might have a backup plan, but the thing that changed might not, your backup plan might not cover that. So what I would say is, almost all of them have changes. What I would say from the standpoint of very large ones, I would, probably a couple. And I would say we've done 15 funded. So there's a couple. I mean, I was going to ask Myra and Mike about this. I mean, I feel like in the ones where, you have questions and you're talking with the supporter, that conversation is like, at what point do you need a change of scope? And what point is you just kind of need to what's going on? And I don't know what you guys think about that, but it wasn't, sometimes there were things where I thought it would be a change of scope and the supporter was like, no, we just need to know. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that. So it doesn't always as big as you think it might be, I think.
Well, I think, I mean, first of all, as a supporter, it's not our backup plan. It's the provider's backup plan. We don't, as supporters, we really don't have much control over what happens in any way. So it's really, if the wheels fall off in a program, then, and it has happened, right? We had one that blew up very badly because the system, the health system, the physicians in the health system just couldn't get engaged for whatever reason. And, there was a change of scope that came through and a backup plan that happened, and it just, it happens. So, but that happens in normal programs too. So traditional CNA. So they happen.
Yeah. From our perspective, I would say the same thing. I would say as long as you keep the partners engaged and involved, stuff happens. And the challenge is with QI programs, there's so many more moving parts, right? Mm-hmm. And there are things that are somewhat out of your control, right? If you're outside of a healthcare system, and even Andrea, you can't necessarily jump into a clinical practice and say, but wait a minute, you need to focus on this, not those patients with COVID that are coming in. Stuff happens, and you just kind of have to adjust. So for sure. Okay. Here's a question. It's an interesting question for Myra. I'll ask you this. What's the typical scale of a QI program? Do they always have to be large? Are there any smaller programs?
That's a good question. They don't always have to be large, but I feel like, you mean in terms of N?
I'm assuming they're talking about, they don't say, but I'm assuming they're talking about budget. I'm assuming, but I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, they do typically tend to be large in budget, but I think because of all the moving parts and all the everything that's required. But I'm trying to think, most of them that we funded, I think, have been on the larger scale, but which is why I think it is important to really have the factors in place that we talked about, because it like has Mike had said, it has very high visibility, and then we want to show that it was a value to support.
Well, Andrea's program wasn't large scale, right? I mean, Andrea, your program had very impressive outcomes, and it was within your health system by itself, right within your hospital. So, yeah, I don't think they have to be huge. You know,
I think though that's being upfront about what your potential end might be, right? So you don't want something that maybe the supporter is thinking is going to be a much larger end and you have a smaller one. So again, I think just being upfront in the scope that you're proposing, and we've had the gamut size wise, but sometimes it feels more impactful in our own organization to have something that isn't so huge because you actually feel like you accomplished it. And I don't know if that, yeah, so.
Yeah.
Other questions?
One other question, which I think is interesting, and Mike, I'll ask you this. What they're asking, I think, is how do you prove, to the degree possible, that the QI program and the education associated with it is what changed practice and not some other outside force that you have no control over?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is, listen, these things run for probably minimum 6 months to a year. And physicians are influenced by all different kinds of things, right? Commercials, ads, patients, sales reps, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's why we run a control group. And that's why we look to the difference, exact same type of physician who was not exposed to the education, and the folks who were exposed to the education, right? Because they're all influenced by the same stuff. So as long as the control group is sound and valid, that's where we land.
Completely agree. Yep. Okay. Great. Thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you, Myra. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Mike, for participating. Thank you, Derek, for inviting us and making this journey a pleasure. And I will turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, and thanks everyone. Great session, a lot of good info, nice feedback that we've been getting on it. So thank all of you. I'm going to jump into my closing slides. Just a reminder, if you have a chance, take our survey. It's right on the live page. It's only a couple of questions, won't take you long, but we do appreciate the feedback. Also a reminder to participate in our CME Palooza scavenger hunt that's going on right now. Just click on the link for Broadcast Beat Studios. You can either plug it into your browser or you can click on the link on our website as well and see if you can find the CME Palooza logo. And then lastly, to view the next session, just go to the link on the live page. Next session is, what time is it? Noon. Implementation Science, Reimagining Solutions to Systems-Based Needs. And a reminder that the archive for this session will be available as soon as we close it out. And for all of the sessions, it'll currently be on our agenda page and then later on our archive page. Big thank you to Array for sponsoring that as well. And with that, our time is up. Thanks to everyone, and I will see the rest of you at 1 p.m. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.